Morning, everybody, and it sure is nice to be back. It's interesting. I love getting back into town. This time, though, back, I found that I had some visitors at home, and those visitors are a bunch of raccoons up in the attic. So we've had an interesting week trying to deal with 3 or 4 raccoons that seem to have found their way into my attic again. Now, for those of you who know me, would have heard this, you would say, well, that story you've heard before. Yes, because this is the 3rd time that we've had visitors. And anybody's had raccoons, they seem to always want to get up around 4 o'clock and make a lot of noise between 4 and 6. So it's been an interesting week. Hopefully, I had somebody there set traps in the attic yesterday, and I told my son, now, while I'm gone today, just go stick your head up there, and if you see some raccoons, just text me and we'll figure out to bring the guy back. But anyway, great to be back. No, things don't start on time in Washington still, so after 14 months, we still haven't fixed that problem. And for those of you that heard that story last year, it is so true. I mean, the #1 issue that I found in Washington was people just don't start on time. And that's why I really appreciate when you get back, and especially go to business meetings here back in the district, you find out that people do start on time here. And that's really the way we should be working things in Washington. We should always start on time, we should get things accomplished, and we should make sure that meetings start and finish on time. So hopefully that's one of the things we can change. The other thing I think I said last year, which is still very true, that the numbers you see and the numbers you hear about in Washington, don't believe them because they're usually worse. That's so true, and it's still true. And the third thing I said last year, which hasn't changed, is probably has just gotten a little worse. It's more political this year than it was last year because, as everybody knows, we have a presidential election this year. So politics seems to really be becoming part of the way of business down there, which is also sad for me. Again, being a businessman for over 30 years, I was always more concerned about getting the job done versus the politics around it. So those 3 things haven't changed, and but I will tell you that we've got a freshman class that was elected last year, and of course some Democrats and Republicans together that believe we have to make changes, and I think that's really has to be the key, so that after 14 months, I think what we're starting to see is there is a new, fresh group of members that really want to get some things changed and some things moving forward. Now, as far as my voting record, most of you know, and you heard that I've been a businessman for 30 years, and I definitely I try and become as pro-business as possible, because if we can get this economy moving again, we can get a lot of things accomplished. And I'm happy to tell you that the U.S. Chamber gave me an award last week, Spirit of Enterprise, for my voting record on pro-business, and I'm very proud to be one of the members of Congress that received that award. So what have we done in Congress? Well, you know, it's kind of interesting because you always hear about gridlock. You hear about not getting things done. You hear about issues that, you know, that's what I run into more than anything when I'm back in the district. Well, you guys just, you know, there's gridlock. You're not getting things done. You're not getting things accomplished. And I think what I try to tell everybody in all of these sessions and these meetings that I have is that what you really have to do is you really have to pull the curtain back and really see what's going on. Because if you really look at what's going on in Washington, the House has passed actually a tremendous amount of bills. We've passed a number of bills to increase oil exploration. We've passed a number of jobs bills. We've passed a number of bills that have gone over to the Senate. And quite frankly, the Senate hasn't done anything with them. And I think that's what you really need to take a good hard look at. You need to be able to see, okay, so what has the House done? You know, if you come to some of my town halls, you'll find out that I'll list the 300 or 400 things that we've passed in the past 14 months, and some of the jobs bills that we've passed. But then you'll ask the question, well, where have they gone? What's happened to them? Well, the problem is they've gone over to the Senate, and the Senate hasn't done anything with them. And that's a problem, because if you really go back to your basic government classes from when we're all back in high school and junior high, I mean, what's supposed to happen is the House passes a bill. Maybe the Senate doesn't like it, but you send it over to the Senate. If the Senate doesn't like it, they either change it or they pass their own bill. And then we go to conference, and then we come up with things we agree to, and then we pass a bill together, and and then it goes on to the president for signing. So if you want to see gridlock in Washington, you really, maybe what we really need to do is make sure that everybody in Congress gets a re-education in how government's supposed to work. And that is that, you know, you pass a bill, you move it over to the other side, the Senate passes a bill, they move it over to the other side, and then we bring it together and we get something accomplished. The problem that I found over this past 14 months, of course, is that that's just not happening. And when you talk about jobs bills, and what are we doing to get the economy moving? Well, we've passed a number of bills. And then again, as I keep telling you, they sit over in the Senate. The other thing that we passed last year, and of course we just passed this year, is the budget. And last year, and isn't it interesting, because I think the budget's something you really need to think about. When people see the budget, they say, well, the Republicans in Congress or the House has passed this budget. And it does, I mean, the line you're going to hear all year, it changes Medicare forever, or it eliminates Medicare forever. But if you really get down to what the budget does, it's a blueprint. It's basically a blueprint over the next 10 years. But remember that the House has to pass a budget every year. So even if you pass a budget over 10 years, that's the blueprint for where you want to go over the next 10 years. But really the most important thing is that budget spells out what you can spend over the next year and what's the direction you would like to see future Congresses go over the next 9 to 10 years. So when you hear the story, well, the Republicans passed this budget and it's, you know, it eliminates Medicare forever. Well, quite frankly, the budget that we just passed this year, one of the things we accomplished this year is we passed a budget that basically cuts spending. It sets the trajectory where we can reduce debt. It actually saves Medicare in the long run, and it creates jobs. So it does 4 very good things, but it has to be evaluated every year. So even when you hear the rhetoric, and that's what always drives me crazy, this political rhetoric. We have it all the time in Washington. You hear it on the TVs, you hear it on the radio stations, and it's this political rhetoric that they say, well, we're Renacci, or the Republicans want to eliminate Medicare forever. Well, think about that. The budget that we just passed doesn't change Medicare or Medicaid for anyone 55 years or older. All right? Which means that the real change, if there's going to be any kind of change, now it sets an idea in position for 10 years out. It sets an idea of where we're going to go in 10 years and where we think maybe the Congress in 10 years should go. But it doesn't mean the guy who passed it this year, he may not even be there, or she may not even be there in 10 years when you actually have to make those changes, because you have to take a budget and then you have to implement it and use that blueprint down the road to change the law. So I always say, look past the rhetoric, but isn't it amazing that the Senate hasn't passed a budget in over 3 years? How can you ever get anything accomplished in government or in business when the Senate, remember, go back to what I said earlier, House is supposed to pass something, the Senate's supposed to pass something, then you bring it together. The Senate hasn't passed something for 3 years. So we have a budget, we passed it. There's some people can throw stones at it. You know, the other side is going to be throwing stones at it all year because this is an election year, of course. And they'll pick pieces out of it that aren't implemented for 8, 10, 12 years from now. They'll throw stones at it. That's the way they do things. But the sad thing is, the Senate hasn't even passed the budget. So what happens then? Well, we have a budget that will just sit there and nothing will get accomplished when it comes to budget. Now the president passed the budget, or didn't pass the budget. He put a budget out earlier this year, and I got to give him credit for that. I mean, at least he put a budget out. Now, his budget was before the House last week, and it was voted on. I don't know how many people saw the votes or paid attention to it. But the president's budget, the Republicans actually put it in front of the House to see who would vote for it. It got 0 votes for and 412 votes against. So at least the president's budget was put out there. And of course it got no votes. It didn't get a vote, it didn't get a yes vote from the Republican or the Democrat side. The House vote, our House budget did pass. And now we're sitting there with that budget. So that's one thing we've accomplished since the last time I was here. But keep in mind, that doesn't mean we're not passing bills. We have bills out there all last year to reduce the size and scope of government. We've had bills that we've passed out of the House to limit EPA's exposure and actually require the EPA to come out and do an economic study of anything they pass and how it affects us. All good. I mean, how can that be a bad bill? I mean, anytime somebody does something, they have to have an economic study to determine its effect on the economy. These are things that we have passed that the Senate hasn't taken up. And I will tell you the Senate has passed a couple of our bills, but if you look at them, most of them were the CR requirements, the current resolution requirements, which kept the government moving forward. And we've passed a couple of the post office namings and you know, some of those things. But these are the things that are frustrating for me because, as I've told many, many people, in the business world, I can sit down with Democrats and Republicans, independents, all types of people, and we got a lot accomplished. That's all of you do. You know, you're all members of the chamber, you're all members of the business community. You can get a lot accomplished if you sit down with a common goal and you decide to work together toward that common goal. Now it's interesting because since last time, I've actually gotten a tremendous amount of friends on the other side. And it's always because I'm willing to work on the other side. And one of the things that occurred during this past year, as you heard on the Financial Services Committee, that I had a member come over and say to me from the other side, you know, one thing I appreciate about you, you don't demagogue, you don't throw stones across the other side. You seem to be really interested in talking to the, you know, we have witnesses that come to these meetings. You seem to be very, very interested in talking to the witnesses. And that's kind of refreshing because this was a new Democrat elected official, elected congressperson. And he said, it's refreshing because I'd really like to see that occur too. So he and I had breakfast, and I might have told you a little bit about this last year, but we had breakfast. And when I was sitting across the table from him, I started to realize he sounded just like me. And I thought, you know, this is pretty interesting because we have some common goals here. We're trying to reduce spending, get our debt in line. You know, these are all common goals. We should all be working together on. So I said to him, do you have some friends that think the same way? And he said, absolutely. And I said, well, so do I. I can tell you what's been great about that group. That group now has grown from just he and I having our first breakfast to 16 of us, 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats. We have breakfast meetings about every 3 weeks. We talk about a number of things we can work together on. We've actually had 4 bills that have been introduced to Congress jointly. One of them was the Employee Act, which basically was an idea where you take unemployment insurance, redirect it toward training. So if you hire somebody, and I might have mentioned this to many of you over this past year because it was frustrating for me because as a business owner, I thought we're spending all this money on unemployment. Let's figure out a way to redirect it to training. And if we redirect it to job training, maybe we can redirect it to employment and get people working again. So this Employee Act, we got on the floor, and it basically takes unemployment dollars and uses them if a business hires somebody and puts them on their payroll, then it and trains them. They can get those unemployment dollars directly to the business. And this came out of the bipartisan group. We worked really hard. We had some hearings on it, and it started to receive a little traction. And in fact, one of the representatives from the President's Department of Labor was at the hearing, and she even came up to me and said, you know, this is probably something we'd be willing to work on. So I saw, you know, this opportunity, and quite frankly, as part of the payroll tax extension that was passed here this last month and a half ago, that provision is now in there. So we've got a provision that we worked on together where the states can actually opt into a waiver to do just that. They can take unemployment dollars and use it for training. So I'm very proud that this working group was able to get that accomplished. And now the states have the opportunity to use unemployment dollars for training. Now the interesting thing is you have to opt in. So far, and it was set at only 10 states. So far, Texas is the only one that's opted in, or at least requested a waiver, I should say. We're looking to see if Ohio I've notified the governor and the governor's office that this is really something Ohio should jump on the bandwagon too. So I'm looking forward to that provision that we were able to work on together to get some traction and hopefully help Ohio train people and increase employment. Because again, we all know that's really where we need to go. We need to make sure that we get this economy rolling, we get jobs created, and we eliminate all that diversion. I mean, again, if I had to tell you what frustrates me more over the last 14 months is the rhetoric that you'll see, and especially on a political year like this year. You know, think about where we need to be. It's all about the jobs, and it's all about economy. But you'll hear the other side, and I'm sure, again, I got to be honest with you, as a business guy for 30 years, I probably didn't pay attention as much as I should have. But I was busy raising a family and developing a business. When you get inside the belly of DC, you really start to see some things that you probably didn't see unless you were there. But this rhetoric is something that all of us have to change. Because after 14 months, I've started to realize that you're trying to move down and talk about jobs and economy, and for the next 7 months, you're going to hear this rhetoric, which has nothing to do with jobs and economy, or this piece of rhetoric, or that piece of rhetoric, and you're starting to hear it already. But if you think about it, if you can't run on what you've accomplished, then you've got to divert people from thinking about what other people are accomplishing. So keep that in mind over the next 7 months, because if there's one thing we can do, all of us in this room can do to fix things. If you see somebody coming out with this rhetoric, call them on it. Ask them, let me have the facts on that. Tell me the facts. When you hear the story that, you know, and I'll use myself, that Jim Renacci wants to eliminate Medicare, I want you to ask that person, really? So tell me, what did Jim Renacci ever do where he wants to eliminate Medicare? Because Jim Renacci really wants to make sure Medicare is around. Jim Renacci wants to make sure it continues to survive. But the interesting thing, if we do nothing, which is the path that many others, many on the other side, if you look at their votes, want to do nothing, Medicare will be insolvent in 9 to 15 years. And it depends, and these are outside groups doing that analysis, not me. So we have to make sure it's around forever. We have to make sure that it's strong. But here's how you can turn that question around, because it's going to come up. When somebody says, so did Jim Renacci really vote? And again, I'm going to use myself personally, since I'm standing here. Did Jim Renacci really vote to eliminate Medicare forever? Ask them what vote he took to do that, because they'll go to the budget. They'll say, well, he voted for this budget. Remember what I told you, the budget's a blueprint. But let me tell you what really is going to change Medicare forever. Has already done that. It's the President's health care bill that was passed 2 years ago. And if you think about it, the President's health care bill cut $500 billion out of Medicare. That's a fact. So when you hear that story, ask the person, well, didn't the President's health care bill cut $500 billion out of Medicare? That's changed Medicare forever. The other thing the President's health care bill did was it set up a 15-member board of unelected officials to make decisions on what gets reimbursed in health care. So think about the rhetoric. Let's really take a look at this rhetoric. You've got rhetoric on one side that the House and what we've passed in this budget wants to change Medicare, but you have facts on this other side of what actually has happened. And let's make sure that we do that over the next 7 months, but also the future, because our country really needs people to start looking at, and again, you know who can fix all of this? We all can fix it. I mean, I didn't go down to Washington to hear all this rhetoric. I went down to Washington to fix things. And I think everybody in this room wants the same thing. We need to get our debt in line. We need to get our spending in line. We need to make sure that we can look at our children and grandchildren someday and say, you know what? We made sure that we left you with something better than what we had. And if we can do that, we can get a lot accomplished. So, that's Washington. And again, it's frustrating, but please, if you get anything out of what I said earlier so far, just remember to pull the curtain back. That's all I ask you. whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, please pull the curtain back, get the facts. If you want factual information, you're welcome to call my office, you're welcome to there's internet, there's all kind of ways to do it. But that's all I ask, because we can change things if we pull the curtain back and see what's really behind some of the statements people are making. With that, I think I have some questions that somebody may want to ask.
We have about 3 or 4 prepared questions that Stark Chambers came up with, and if you do have some of your own, we do have a couple of microphones out here, and as soon as we get done with our questions, we'll go ahead and open it up to the audience. The state's oil and gas activity mostly regulated by the state, not the feds. So what are the chances the U.S. EPA will impose greater jurisdiction over hydraulic fracturing and slow down oil and gas development, and what would Congress be willing to do about it?
Well, especially for Ohio, fracking is a great opportunity, but it has to be done right. It has to be done environmentally right. We've got to make sure the environment's protected, but at the same time, we've got to make sure that we look at the opportunities for jobs and job creation. What the federal EPA has done, I'm not sure what they're going to do on this case, but I can tell you what they've been doing. They've been getting involved in many things, in my opinion, that are overreaching. That's why we passed a law that said if you're going to pass something, or if the EPA is going to make a standard or set a new regulation, let's do an economic study to determine how it affects the economy and the people that we're making regulations on. It's the interesting thing. In Washington, I've said this all along, people make decisions without having to live with them. It's pretty easy for me to make a decision and not have to live with it. It's a lot tougher when you're on the other side and you make a decision and then you have to live with it. So my goal, and I'm sure the Republican Congress, the Republican-led House, would want to limit the ability for the federal EPA. We already have an Ohio EPA. We want to limit the ability for the federal EPA to get too much involved in this. Let Ohio take care of Ohio, and let Ohio's EPA take care of Ohio.
Under new congressional districts, Stark County's national influence will be divided like never before. Now, how would you advise current and soon-to-be former constituents on dealing with the splitting up of Stark County?
Yeah, it's an interesting issue, and again, if it was up to me, I always tell people I would have left my district just intact the way it is. I really enjoyed serving Stark and Wayne and Ashland and Medina counties. I got to know so many people, but of course I wasn't the one that had the opportunity to make those changes. But what I would tell you is, look, I'm a firm believer we have a number of good Congress people now that represent Stark County. Bob Gibbs, of course, will be representing a big chunk of Stark County. Bob's a friend of mine, someone I know that is concerned about many of the same business issues that we're also concerned about. And I think we need to, from the standpoint of people in Stark County, they need to look at all their representatives. And I know that myself and Bob are willing to work across the aisle with the other side that will also represent Stark County too. So I think the goal would be that you go to the representative you feel most comfortable with, and you work with that person, and then he engages the other Congress people in the county, and you get things accomplished. I will tell you a great example. I've had some people come to me about the Great Lakes region. And the Great Lakes region, of course, includes multiple Congress people from both sides of the aisle, and it deals with, transportation on the Great Lakes. And again, what I've been trying to do is set up a program so all of us get together and work together on the Great Lakes region. So I look at it from the bigger picture, Northeast Ohio, and then I look at it now from the county. You actually will have 3 people representing you, and you can make that actually work towards your advantage by having 3 people working together.
We'll have to ask you, are you going to miss Dennis Kucinich?
I've gotten to know so many of the people on the other side. I've gotten to know Dennis too, and even though many people say to me he's odd or strange, he's actually a good man in a lot of ways. Take away his votes. Let's face it, we're all human beings down there trying to get a job done. And Dennis thinks a little different, but he's actually an interesting person who I've actually become friends with over the years.
And he might be running from Washington State, so we could be working with him again. go.
Exactly.
This one's going to hit close to home for you. Will Congress get involved in the fight between the administration and religious organizations over requirements for mandatory contraceptive coverage? Considering the large faith-based employers we have in Stark County that could be affected by these requirements, it's very much a business question as well as a religious question.
Right. Well, you know, it's interesting because this is the rhetoric I talk about. This is really a First Amendment rights issue. This is a, you know, it's when it comes to contraception, I mean, I'm a firm believer that if you use contraception, that's fine. If you want to use it, that's fine. But you shouldn't force a religious organization that doesn't believe. You shouldn't force anybody when it comes to First Amendment rights to do something outside of what they believe in. And that's what the real core of that argument is. And it really doesn't have anything to do with contraception. It has everything to do with First Amendment rights, and that's what we have to zero in on. What are the rights of a religious organization? And that's why I think it's so important that we take a look at it, take the rhetoric out, take all the things that the other side wants to use to prove a point. Let's really look at what it is. It's a First Amendment right. We have to make sure that our First Amendment right is protected.
You mentioned the president's budget going down in flames, so this question could be a little bit moot, but it could come back up at some point in time. His budget proposal sought to reduce the charitable deduction from 35% to 28% for persons earning more than $200,000 per year and families earning more than $250,000. What do you think of that idea?
Well, when it comes to taxes, you know, I'm a firm believer that we need to simplify the tax code. I'm a CPA. I've done many tax returns. I understand the complications of the tax code. So there has to be simplification. We have to look at everything. But I'm not too sure we should be looking at charitable contributions as the all-too way of changing the tax code. I think the tax code has to be looked at across the board. You know, when it comes to loopholes, we need to eliminate loopholes. We need to reduce the tax rate. We need to make sure that, and by the way, this is another rhetoric thing, pull the curtain across. When you hear that oil companies get subsidies, now I've been in Congress for 14 months, I've yet to find a subsidy, an amount of money that's being paid to the oil companies, because it's not the case. What the oil companies get is the same thing all of you business owners get, or anybody that you represent get. They get tax preferences. All right, so why do you pick on the oil companies? Well, because you know what? It's a political rhetoric way of doing things. But let's really, if you want to get rid of tax loopholes, I'm all for that. But don't just say it's the oil companies, because the minute you look at the oil companies, you know, I just heard this the other day, how about Apple Computer? And I'm not saying attack Apple Computer. They're a very profitable company too. So if we start looking at all those people that are profitable, I think the answer is we need to get rid of loopholes, we need to reduce the tax rate down, but we need to make it a fairer and simpler tax code across the board.
The Supreme Court will soon be issuing its ruling on the constitutionality of the individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act. You want to take a stab at what that ruling is going to be, and regardless of the result, what are your thoughts on the health care law's future?
Yeah. Well, when I ran for Congress, I always told you that the health care law, one of the first things I would do would repeal it, and that was one of the first votes I took. I believe the health care law does have some good provisions. You know, pre-existing conditions, some of the caps, those are all things we need to look at. Those could have all been handled in about 4 or 5 pages. It's the rest of the bill that I've said is toxic. It has caused increases in healthcare costs. It has caused unemployment in many cases. It's caused an employer, if their healthcare costs have gone up, they've had to lay people off, and I've seen that in the district. So that's those are some of the concerns I have. Now, individual mandate, look, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I think the president last week statement shows you where he thinks it's going. Quite frankly, I heard this from one of my constituents, because I really had to think about it. The minute you have the government start to require you to buy health insurance, what's next? And I think one of the judges, one of the Supreme Court judges said this too. Will the government be requiring you to buy cell phones? Or this was a quote from him, not from me. But the one thing I heard, which I thought was really interesting, if you believe it's in the best interest going forward, how about if the government decides that, and again, this didn't come from me, this came from one of my constituents, but I thought it was interesting. How about the government decides that all of a sudden the only vehicle you can buy is a General Motors car because it's an American car and you can't buy any other car? Just think about, when you start to hear some of my constituents, which are all of you, start saying these things, you start to realize that some of the people in my district are starting to get it. You don't really want the government telling you, because now they own General Motors, that it's in the best interest of the government to start buying General Motors cars. It's an interesting concept, but I really do believe that the individual mandate, it appears, anytime you have the government requiring you to do something, like buy health insurance, we should, it'll be interesting to see what the judges do. I'm not going to really tell you what I think they're going to do, because I think that's up to them, but I do see, it appears that the individual mandate probably is problematic. And with that, I've heard some of the judges talk that in their conversations that if you just strike one piece, you might have to strike the whole bit. So we'll see where it ends up. We're going to know that in June.
All right, one more from us, and then we'll take some from the floor. You were an early supporter of Governor Romney for the GOP nomination. In fact, your last time, I think Donald Trump was still in the running, and you were weighing the options.
I think Governor Romney ended up being your candidate.
Where does that race stand now? And how do you think, if Romney is the nominee, he's going to do it in Ohio and nationally against the president as well?
Well, again, the only vote that really matters is the one on November 6th. So I tell that to everybody. Polls and all those things. You hear polls every day. Polls can change every day. It's amazing how polls go up and down. The only poll that really matters is the one on November 6th. I came out early on and endorsed Governor Romney because I had a number of people that were asking me, what do you think? Who do you think should be the candidate? And in the beginning, I just stood back and said, look, this isn't really something I should make a decision on. This is what the people should make a decision on. And I was in a room one day and somebody said, okay, forget your answering as a congressman, answer as an individual. Tell me individually what you believe. And I said, well, without giving an answer, I'm going to tell you this. I ran on a platform that I believe that Washington is broken. I believe we need to put people in Washington who have made payrolls, who have balanced the budget. I believe we need to have people in Washington who understand what it is to live with the rules that you're making. I also believe we need to have people in Washington that understand we can't continue to go down and increase the debt and increase spending. You just can't do that as a family. You can't do that as a business. I said, so you tell me who I should support. It was kind of interesting because when I was in this room, most of them looked at me and said, you must be supporting Governor Romney. And I said, well, that's exactly right. I would support Governor Romney because of that. If you look at the other candidates, one thing I have learned in the last 14 months, I don't believe we should send somebody back to Washington that's been in Washington their whole career, because if it's broken, they're just going to use the broken system because that's all they know. I really do think we need people in Washington that understand what it means really to make that payroll, to balance that budget. There was one other thing. It's interesting. You said Donald Trump, because I really never thought Donald Trump was in there. He was a business guy. The problem with Donald Trump was that Donald Trump believes that you can just go in. Like I can come into this room and tell all of you this is the way it's going to be. That just doesn't work in Washington. What you really need to have is you need to have some governmental executive experience. And that's what I really liked about Governor Romney, because that's one little addition that he has. One thing I've learned as a business guy, when you go to Washington, if you walk in there and think, this is the right way of doing things, it's factually based, it has all the factual support, here's all the good things about it, yeah, there's some negative things. That's the way anybody in the business world makes decisions. When you get to Washington, that doesn't work. You really have to go down there and you have to make people understand it, believe it. You got to get bipartisan support. And so I think you need a little bit of executive experience. So really, if you take Romney's background with this executive experience, I think that will be a good, in all different times of this country's life, there needed to be a certain leader. We now need to turn this economy around. Our weakest issue going forward is a national debt. If you think about it, if you really want to look at where we could be someday and how weak we could be, if we let this national debt continue to go where it's going, we will be in big trouble when it comes to our standing in this world. So we need somebody today that can turn that around, and that's what I think it will be.
That's it for our prepared questions. And we tried to cover a lot of the areas that we thought would be of some interest. Undoubtedly, people have their own questions, and Steve's got Mike, Mark has Mike. We'll start here with Sue.
There's a group of parents sitting here at this table, and every single one of us have kids in school that are learning how to read. We've been fighting with the schools at trying to get reading instruction in the schools, but it doesn't happen. There isn't a support system. The teachers aren't trained. The universities aren't training the teachers how to teach reading. And as for example, my son he will graduate from high school here in about a month with an inability to read. When you talk about facts, you can link welfare, you can link unemployment, you can link poverty, all to illiteracy. Jobs, where's my son stand with jobs? How do you train him? You talk about increasing job training. How do you train him when he doesn't know how to read? I mean, he's basically functionally illiterate. How do you support us who are struggling so severely at getting our kids reading support?
Well, of course, I'm a parent. I have 3 children that are in college right now. I do understand those issues. We have to make sure. Sorry. Well, what I'm saying is I do support education. I support it. It's a local issue. I really believe that we need to take a look at our teachers. I mean, you're talking about your son who went.
Not necessarily nationwide. If you look at the statistics, they claim 67% of the kids in this country do not read proficiently. 67%, that's nationwide, that's not local.
Let me ask you this. Here's the best way of explaining it. I sat down with a bunch of superintendents from all over the country. You know what they said to me? They said, nobody learns the same way. So you shouldn't have one standard across the country. You shouldn't have one standard from 1,000 miles away. What you should have is a child learns different in Louisiana. They learn different in Ohio. They learn different. It depends on their surroundings. So it's a local issue. It's an issue where local schools have to learn to teach reading, writing, the sciences, all those things. I'd almost like to turn the question back to you. Tell me what you think the federal government should do.
They have laws like No Child Left Behind. The intent was probably very good, but it didn't get what it wanted to get. It wanted to bring science of teaching reading into the school systems. That didn't happen. It hasn't happened. In fact, it's probably at points made things even worse. They need to take those laws and revise them to get the teaching of the science of teaching reading into the schools. It's not happening. It needs to happen. Without it, the schools will never be able to teach the kids how to read.
And why would they, again, it's kind of a conversation between you and me, but why do you think the federal government should do that? How about the state and the local school boards?
Because the federal government has already put their fingers into it. They already have No Child Left Behind.
Well,
I mean, if the federal government, if it's not a federal government issue, why do they have No Child Left Behind?
well, what I'm telling you is the federal government needs to get their hands out of it. The federal government needs to get their hands out of it. This is an issue that we need to make sure that the states are in control of. This is an issue you do not want somebody 1,000 miles away trying to tell you, your school district, how your child should be taught. Okay. So I'm a firm believer that we need to get the federal government out of the way. Well, and the best way of handling that is getting it back on the local issue, getting the teachers to teach, putting the local school boards and the state in charge, and getting the federal government out. To get out of the way.
You know, Senator Olslayer sitting right behind you.
Yeah, so I think the state, yeah, I think that's definitely a. Well, I support, again, it's a state issue, and I definitely support the states getting involved. I keep going back to the same thing. Well, we have to train people. The federal government. You get that back on the local level, and I keep going back to that. You don't have somebody 1,000 miles away trying to determine how your child should be taught to read. You bring that back to the state and local level.
We're going to get these two guys together as well as some folks from Kent State after we're done. So, and then you can talk to the congressman as well. If you've got any more, Steve, Mark. Get much for that.
He has a hard time reading with suicide. But I have another issue too, because I have the opposite spectrum where I have one excellent student and I have one poor reader. My excellent student, like now, has gotten into George Washington, but because we are middle class Americans, we're not getting any financial aid. So she got accepted her acceptance letter at George Washington University last Monday. And I'm trying to get her some assistance, financial aid, but because we have a small business, that's, is that being held against us? Because I can't afford to send her to George Washington University. But yet I have a poor reader. So I go from one spectrum to the other. What am I supposed to do as a middle-class American?
We have, actually I had a session at Stark State here just a few months ago showing all the opportunities for federal aid, federal loans. And I think those are the things we need to do. We need to look at all those opportunities, see what works, and see what are the best ways to get that. Because we need to make sure that our children here are educated. We need to make sure they have those opportunities. Those are all important things for the future. But we have to be able to look within the realm. What we have to make sure we don't do is look to the federal government for all the answers. The federal government, I think that's so important. One of the reasons we've gotten so much trouble in this country is that the federal government does not have all the answers. In fact, the federal government shouldn't have all the answers. We need to get as much back to the local level and the state level as we can. And you really need to get the federal government out of it. But it doesn't mean that I'm not for grants and loans and all of those opportunities. And that's why we had that session. And hopefully you were able to find something. If not, I think you can contact my office and let them know some of the things you ran into problems with. That's how we get better educated too on issues like that.
Paul?
Congressman, thank you for coming and spending the morning with us. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening on the scene of gas? I know our family owns a family business, and we can tell when the gas goes up, business goes down. So can you tell us what's happening on that front?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you're right. Now, I'm going to speak as a business person. It's all about supply and demand. Nobody can argue that the more supply there is, the price comes down on anything. If you have a large supply of milk or wheat or all of those things, when there's a large supply, the price comes down. We have gotten ourselves in a position that even though you hear the president, this gets back to rhetoric, you hear the president say we are drilling more today than we did the last 4 to 8 years. The better question would be pull the curtain back and ask him, are we drilling as much as we did 20 years ago and 30 years ago and 10 years ago? Because what he's doing is he's comparing to some of the lowest years when he does his comparison. So wouldn't it be interesting if we took American ideas, American energy, American oil, American wind, American solar, American nuclear, all of these things, and said we are going to become self-sufficient, and at the same time, oil, gas, all of those things. Let's start making sure that we take a look at our American opportunities and start bringing those to the table. We have passed a number of regulations, a number of opportunities for more drilling, more permitting, more use of getting oil on government land, only for the Senate not to take those up. We need to be able to move forward on that.
Anybody else? We have time for maybe one, no more than two more. Mark's bring it back to you.
Thank you, Congressman, for being here. I wanted to go back to your comment about the Employment Act. When I had heard you speak last year, you had mentioned something about an act that you were working on. It was bipartisan, and I applaud you for that. And in this one, you were talking about how we could take unemployment dollars and turn them into training and wages, actually. And I believe it had to do with if we hired someone who was currently on unemployment, that the government would then reimburse us a certain amount of what that person would have made on unemployment if we hired them at a certain percent above what they were making on unemployment. Are those the same things? Is that the Employment Act that you just mentioned?
Yeah, the Employment Act is just that. We had a bill in Congress that basically said if you hire somebody who's unemployed today, you pay them at least 110% of what they were getting on unemployment, that the government, that the unemployment could be reimbursed to that employer up to 90%. That was the Employee Act. What was passed in the Payroll Tax Act was the opportunity for states, 10 states in this country, to be able to take unemployment dollars and do just that. So that's what I was saying. That idea, and actually it was written, it said like the Employee Act, to do just this. So it was one of the examples that a state could use. So today, Texas has applied for one of those waivers, and that's why I was hoping Ohio would apply for one too.
So then our actions as constituents is to try to put some pressure on our state to opt in so that we can then take advantage of that, get people off of the unemployment rolls, get them as active workers. Is that it?
And remember, it's getting them off the unemployment rolls to train them.
Exactly.
Which is the most important thing, train them for new jobs. When I talk to the trucking industry, they'd love to have that opportunity. When I talk to the oil and gas industry, they'd love to be able to train new people that are unemployed. I mean, these are such great opportunities to use those unemployment dollars for training.
Thank you very much.
I hate to put them on the spot again, but you're sitting with Senator Wilson. Just right about it. We've got time for one more question because we do want to have some quality time at the end that you can talk to the congressman on the road.
It might be a congressman to ask this question. You know, we've had so many extensions to the transportation bill that whether it be federal highway or whether it be airports,
it's very difficult for, I think, those organizations to plan ahead. Moving forward, and I see there was an extension done here recently, can I make the assumption it's not going to be done in this year and moving forward to next year? Do you think there'll be a long-range transportation bill passed at some point soon?
Well, there needs to be a long-range transportation bill passed. The problem is we had a Senate who believed, and again, I'll give the Senate credit on this one, they did come up with a bill. It was a 2-year plan. It had some provisions that were not liked. The House had a 5-year plan, which again, 5 years is better than 2. More than 5 years would even be better, but a 5-year bill is better than a 2-year bill. So the House is really trying to make sure that we have a 5-year bill because we want to make sure that transportation and infrastructure, people can plan. I mean, how do you plan on building a road that takes 3 years on a 1-year bill or a 3-month extension or a 2-year bill? You know, as a mayor of my community, I knew that there was a road project that from start to finish was probably 7 years. Well, we need to be able to make sure that there's certainty and predictability. So you're going to see us go back and try and really work a transportation bill that is longer than 2 years. The problem, though, and it's the problem we all have to think about, transportation, infrastructure, roads and bridges has been paid for by gasoline tax based on cars that were getting 10 or 12 miles to a gallon. Now that a car is getting 20 to 23 miles to a gallon, the gas tax amount coming into the federal government is a lot less. So the real problem at the federal level is how do you pay for the infrastructure when the gasoline tax has come down so far? One of the things we tried to do out of the House was pass to allow new drilling in the Gulf. In fact, we did pass this, allow new drilling in the Gulf, which we would take a royalty from that new drilling, from that oil. And so if you think about it, there's job creation in the Gulf. There's more oil opportunities so that we can reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and at the same time take those royalty dollars and fill the gap in the transportation bill so we can have a long-term transportation bill well-funded. That was one of the things that the House is working on. Hopefully we can get that done, but that's something that we definitely need to get done as a longer-term transportation bill for our airports, our highways, all those things.
promised to get everybody out of here by about 9 o'clock. Also, I neglected to mention that Mayor Maslin is here, Kathy Kennedy-Perry, Kim Henson. We have 2 elected officials here as well as the congressman. Congressman, we'll try and get you back here maybe again before the election, and definitely after. A little update in that lane drive session. There's always interesting things happen during that last couple of months of those events. But the congressman will be here for a little bit to chat with you. And again, we appreciate you coming. And closing remarks you'd like?
No, again, I just want to thank you all. It's great to be back in my office. My staff is here. I've got Tom and Randy here somewhere. We do have a great staff. If you need anything, make sure you contact them. That's really what this is all about. It's about me representing you, and I'm honored to be able to do that. I look forward to being able to serve you the rest of this year and hopefully on forward, so that we can continue to bring the right change to Washington. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.